All right, the next series of lectures here, we're going to talk about the functions of different parts of the brain. And if you have not done the nervous system anatomy part yet, you might want to go through that before moving on through these lectures about brain function, so you're familiar with the different anatomical features there, because I'm not going to go back through all of the anatomy here over on the physiology side. Now, I will do a little bit of a brief overview, just kind of orient us for this particular lecture. But all right, the brain is divided up into four major areas, and the main part of the brain that you see here, and as we're learning about over on the anatomy side, is called the cerebrum. It's divided up into two halves called the cerebral hemisphere, so it's split right down the middle with a mid-sagittal section through the brain. The cerebrum is divided up into different lobes: frontal lobe, they're in blue, parietal lobes, occipital lobe, temporal lobe. Then you have an area of the brain called the diencephalon. You can't see that on this particular diagram because it's deeper inside the brain, right around in here in this area. The brainstem is the lower part of the brain down in here that's going to connect directly to the spinal cord down in here. Remember that big hole in the occipital bone, the foramen magnum? That's where your spinal cord and your brainstem are meeting up. That's divided into three areas: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. And then finally, there's this in the inferior posterior section of the brain. There's an area called the cerebellum that we'll talk about on a separate video lecture, that has some of its own functions. It almost looks like a little miniature brain itself that's attached to the cerebrum. All right, and then we've mentioned before that within the brain you have gray and white matter, just like you do in the spinal cord as well. And remember, gray matter, the reason the gray color occurs is because you have lots of cell bodies of neurons, and then your white matter, you don't really have cell bodies in the whitish areas. The white color becomes from myelinated axons. So there are millions and billions of axons that are myelinated, that are extending from different neurons. And some of those within the white matter, and some of those are ascending. They're moving upward toward the brain from lower areas of the body, lower areas of the nervous system. Or in other cases, they're descending. And in other cases, they may be crisscrossing from one side of the brain to the other. So that's what you have in the white matter. Notice also you do have areas of gray matter. These are gray matter areas over here in green. This is a coronal section through the brain, as you can see over there on that diagram. There's some gray matter areas over here as well, down in here. And so those are going to be areas that are deeper in the brain, where you also have clusters of cell bodies of neurons. And those different areas have different functions. All right, now all this gray matter area at the surface of the brain, the superficial portions, and even here where it wiggles its way downward into these sulci in the brain. Remember, sulcus is like a depression or a valley there at the surface of the brain. All of that is called the cerebral cortex. And of course, that's going to extend all the way across the surface of the brain, and that's where you have the majority of the cell bodies of your brain neurons. And different areas, different sections of the cerebral cortex have different functions, which we'll hit some of the highlights on as well. Okay, here's another diagram from your textbook, which is just showing you the different lobes of the brain that you're learning about over on the anatomy side. And remember that the cerebral cortex is very wrinkled, and when you have a hill or an elevated area, that's called a gyrus. Gyri is plural. And then the valleys are the depressions. A single one is called a sulcus. The plural of that is sulci. And so even the areas lining those sulci are grayish in color because you have cell bodies of neurons. Then why is the cerebral cortex so wrinkled? Because as you can see, if you wrinkle the surface, you have more area, surface area, for cell bodies. You can have more neurons within your cerebral cortex. So an animal with advanced intelligence, like a human being, is going to have a more wrinkled cerebral cortex because we need more surface area for cerebral cortex neurons because we're capable of more complex thoughts and functions. An animal that does not have the same level of intelligence as a human, the cerebral cortex is actually not quite as wrinkled as ours is. All right, so the cerebral cortex is actually pretty thin, 2 to 4 millimeters in depth, and let's see, a centimeter is about a half an inch. So that's about, maybe an eighth of an inch or so, not very deep. So pretty thin, maybe a little bit thicker than an eighth of an inch. And so all across the surface of the brain, most superficial area, that's where you're going to have most of the neurons in the brain. And it actually does account for 40% of the mass of the brain, though, as well. One of the key things to remember about your cerebral cortex, this is where the conscious mind exists. So this part of the brain is involved in awareness, what's going on around us, self-awareness, what constitutes me, what are my body parts, what's my left and what's my right, and so forth. So all your sensory perceptions are interpreted in that area. The cerebral cortex, there are areas that make decisions about what skeletal muscles you're going to use. You're going to contract communication, understanding, written language and sounds and so forth. All of these things happen in your cerebral cortex. And as we'll see, different sections, different regions of the cerebral cortex have different functions. Another important thing, which we're mentioning over on the anatomy side as well, each hemisphere, the left and the right hemisphere, left and right sides of the brain, are connected to the contralateral side of the body. You have this crisscrossing that takes place. And if we back up over here, over on the anatomy side, you're learning about a brain structure called the corpus callosum, which is right in here. And that is a location where you have a lot of crisscrossing of nerve fibers, axons, myelinated axons from one side of the brain to the other. And then in earlier video lectures, we saw how you can have axons that are extending downward from the brain down into the spinal cord. And at some point, they cross over from left to right or from right to left. So that's why the left side of the brain tends to control the right side of the body. The right side of the brain tends to control the left side of the body. All right, there are 3 major types of functional areas in the cerebral cortex. You have motor areas, which, as you might guess, those are going to control voluntary movement. So on an earlier video lecture, we talked about how you have upper motor neurons. Those are the cell bodies of those are up here in your cerebral cortex, and they're the neurons that send signals downward to lower motor neurons, most of which are in your spinal cord. Some, though, are in the brainstem. And then the lower motor neurons are the ones that actually send action potentials out to your skeletal muscle fibers. Then you have sensory areas. So these are neurons within the cerebral cortex that allow you to perceive your senses. So, when your sense of smell, vision, things like that, sounds that you're hearing, touch, pain, those are perceived up here in the cerebral cortex. Then you have areas that are called association areas. So these contain neurons that put together various bits of information. A good example is when you smell something, like if you strike a match. We all know that sulfury kind of smell, smoky smell from a match that has been struck. Association areas in the brain take that smell sense information that has come in from the nose and relates that to past memories about things that we have smelled and comes up with this idea that, hey, that's a match that's been struck. Or, when you hear somebody's voice and you know that person, you have neurons in your brain that are hearing these sounds. You have neurons that store memories of those sounds. Your association areas have to put those two types of information together so that you recognize a sound or a voice. So all of our conscious behavior requires and involves the entire cerebral cortex. All of these different areas are very important. Okay, so this is a diagram from your textbook which shows you some of the major divisions of the cerebral cortex here, and we're going to hit some highlights on this information. We're not going to go into quite the depth that your textbook has. We could probably have almost an entire class on brain function if we wanted to. So notice though that over in here, highlighted in red, these areas of the brain are your motor areas, which are going to be involved in controlling your skeletal muscles. Then back here in blue, your bluish areas are involved in your senses, your various senses: touch, pain, sight, sound, hearing. I think I already said sound, didn't I? Those types of things are dealt with back here in these sensory areas. And then in pink, these are areas where you have your associations going on. For example, up in here, this whole area is called your prefrontal cortex. So it's up here in the very frontal part of the brain. And in here, this is where you have working memory. This is where you decide how you're going to execute tasks. Problem solving and so forth takes place in this area. All right, now let's talk about a little bit more about some of the motor areas of the brain. There's a really important strip of motor neurons in the brain called the primary motor cortex. And if you notice up here on this brain diagram, this is the anterior part of the brain. This is posterior back in here. Okay, over on the anatomy side, you're learning about the central sulcus, which is a deep depression that you have between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobes of the brain. And so right just anterior to that central sulcus, you have a gyrus, an elevated area that runs in a strip across that area. That's called the precentral gyrus. And here you're seeing one side of it in a coronal section. So all of this would be your precentral gyrus over on one side of the brain, and the motor neurons whose cell bodies are in here, these are primary motor neurons, or I'm sorry, upper motor neurons that live in this part of the brain, and they're involved in controlling your skeletal muscles. They make up your primary motor cortex area of the brain. And interestingly, the neurons whose cell bodies are in particular locations control muscles in particular areas of the body. So for example, like over in here, the neurons that are located here, they're going to be sending signals to the motor neurons that control swallowing muscles. Or over in here, along that whole strip right in there, you've got upper motor neurons that are going to help control your facial muscles. Or over in here, you've got motor neurons that control the muscles of the hand. Over in here, the motor neurons control the muscles of the legs. And if you kind of notice the weird sizes of the different body parts on there, if you think about it like with your hand is capable of a lot of complex movements, very delicate movements. And so because of that, you have to have a lot more precision in the control. And so there are a whole lot more upper motor neurons up here that are involved in controlling the muscles of the hands. Whereas with your legs and your feet, you don't have the same type of precise movements that you do with your hands. Your movements are a little bit clunkier. So you actually don't have nearly as many upper motor neurons in your primary motor cortex that control those muscles. Muscles of the face. Think about all the delicate, subtle changes in your facial expressions that can occur. So you actually have a huge strip of upper motor neurons that control your facial muscles. This whole diagram here is actually called a homunculus when you see these, where they're showing you the layout of areas within this primary motor cortex. There's also going to be a sensory cortex as well that we'll talk about shortly, where your senses are interpreted from different parts of the body and laid out in kind of a similar way as well. That's called a homunculus, where they're drawing in those body parts like that and showing you which parts of the brain there control different areas. All right, then there's another area that's involved in motor control, and it's called Broca's area. And let me back up over here to this diagram. Right in here, this area that's highlighted with that dashed line, and we're just ahead of our primary motor cortex over here. That's called Broca's area. Broca's area, the neurons that are located there are involved in speech. So it controls the muscles that are important for speech. So you have a pretty big area of cerebral cortex devoted to speech. So you do want to remember that the Broca's area is important for speech. You know, this information is important because think about it, like if somebody had a stroke and the stroke cuts off blood supply to certain areas of the brain. If the blood supply has been cut off to the neurons in Broca's area, then that is going to affect speech. You know, if the stroke cuts off the blood supply to neurons that are involved in some other type of sensation or sensation interpretation, it's going to affect that person's ability to carry out those types of functions. So kind of knowing the map of the brain helps explain why certain types of injuries or illnesses can lead to loss or loss of certain kinds of functions. All right, how about some of the sensory areas of the brain? We'll talk about some of these. There is a primary somatosensory cortex, which is aligned with the primary motor cortex. It's just posterior to it. Then we have an association cortex, which involves taking sensory information and relating it to past experiences to help you interpret what those senses are and what they mean. Then there are specific sensory areas that are devoted to vision and sounds. Your vestibular cortex is devoted to your sense of balance, your position, and so forth. Visceral sensory area, senses coming from the viscera, internal organs. Gustatory is taste, and olfactory refers to smell, your sense of smell. So there are different areas of the brain that are devoted to those different functions. All right, your primary somatosensory cortex. Somato refers to the body, as we've heard of before, so body senses. And you have a gyrus called the post-central gyrus. So the precentral gyrus is your motor control area. Post-central gyrus deals with body sensations. So these are the neurons that receive incoming information from the skin, your skeletal muscles, and your joints. Information coming from different parts of the body will go to different sections of this primary somatosensory cortex. And so because things are laid out this way, this is why you know when somebody touches you on your right wrist that you know it's the right wrist that's being touched and not some other part of the body. So here's a homunculus, a road map, which is showing you the primary somatosensory cortex and where these different sensations have been mapped. So kind of like we saw with the muscle control, there are neurons up here in this area that receive sensory signals from different parts of the body. So kind of like we saw with the muscles, you got a big area along in here that's devoted to facial sensations. Your face is very sensitive to touch and other types of sensations. You have a lot of area devoted to the hand, lesser to things like the legs. Although look at your feet, you got a pretty big area devoted to the foot. Your foot tends to take in a lot of sensory info, and some of this info is also coming from your joints. You know, are you leaning this way? Are you leaning that way? Are you leaning forward? And very often those types of things are done subconsciously to help you stay standing, to remain in position, or if you're running, you know, keep your feet positioned properly so you don't wind up rolling your foot this way or rolling your foot that way. Those types of things are going on all the time, and we don't even realize it. Okay, then we have visual areas of the brain, and the visual areas are divided up into a primary cortex. Okay, and so that's the neurons that are located there are directly receiving incoming signals from the retinas in the eyes. So the neurons there that deal with detecting light and different colors of light and so forth, they generate action potentials that wind up heading backwards through your optic nerves, which remember crisscross in that optic chiasma at the sella turcica, and head backwards towards the extreme posterior tip of the occipital lobe. That's where your primary visual cortex is located. Then you have a larger visual association area that surrounds the primary visual cortex, and this is where you take this vision information and you compare it to past memory so that you know what something is. I know that color is red. I know that that person is Bob. Those types of things are, those types of realizations that we have occur from the visual association area. So lots of complex signaling going on there. Let me see if I've got that. I do not have that in the map. Let me back up over here to our brain map. So if you look back here, dark blue, a posterior inferior portion of the occipital lobe of the brain, that's your primary visual cortex. So the optic nerves with all their axons inside them, action potentials head backwards this way to the primary visual cortex. And then the surrounding area is your visual association area. All right, and then we're getting ready to talk about auditory sounds. And if you look here on your brain map, you have a primary auditory cortex right in here. So that's where sounds are received, and you know, loud, soft, high-pitched, low-pitched, things like that. Then there's a surrounding auditory association area where sounds that come into the brain are compared to past memory so that we can identify what they are. Yeah, so your auditory association area stores memories of sounds and permits your perception of sounds. What is that sound? That was an explosion. That's a dog barking. That's a cat meowing. That's water dripping out of the faucet, things like that. And again, imagine if you have a patient who has experienced damage to that area. Like, what if your auditory association area was damaged, but your primary auditory cortex was not damaged due to an injury? You would still be able to hear, but you would not know what you were hearing, or it might be more difficult for you to figure that type of thing out. Okay, the prefrontal cortex, so this is the most anterior portion of the brain. This is considered to be the most complicated area of the cortex, which also means it's probably the least understood as well. This is involved with your intellect, understanding things, recalling information, like when you're studying and trying to recall what you've learned. Your personality, you know, what type of personality you have, comes from motor neuron, or not motor, neurons signaling each other in this part of the brain. Judgment, reasoning, persistence, your conscience, awareness, this is weighing on my conscience, this is making me feel guilty. Those types of things are all generated within this prefrontal cortex area. And this area develops, so by development, you know, what neurons are making synapses with each other and signaling each other in this part of the brain. Your social environment, you know, as you're growing up, your experiences and so forth that you have help dictate the development of this part of the brain to at least some degree. I know that some of that information is kind of vague, and this is a part of the brain which is not really surprising. You know, it's how did we get? We don't really know very much yet about how a bunch of neurons networking with each other and forming synapses can lead to things like judgment and reasoning and feeling guilty and so forth. All right, then there is an area in the posterior portion of the brain called a posterior association area, and it's in the temporal, parietal, occipital lobes. This is a large area that's involved in recognizing different patterns and faces, and also your own self-awareness. Where am I in space? Right now I'm sitting in a chair, and I'm in a room in my house. You know, how do I know those types of things? And then there's also a special area called Wernicke's area. So Broca's area, the neurons that are located there control the muscles that you use for speech. Wernicke's area is involved in you being able to understand both written and spoken language. Let me go back to my brain map over here. So here's your Wernicke's area. That's a pretty big area of the brain back here that's devoted to understanding spoken and written language. So all of this huge area back in here is what we're talking about, this posterior association area. All right, now some of this you've probably heard of before, left brain versus right brain. Lateralization, that means there are cortical functions that are primarily occurring either on the left or the right side, because your brain the cortex is symmetrical, so you have a left and a right side with each of these areas. So the left portion of the brain, generally the neurons that are located there are going to be the ones that are primarily in control of things like language, math, and logic. So you have similar areas, of course, over on the right side of the brain, but the neurons in particular regions over there are not going to be quite as involved in most people with language, math, and logic. The right hemisphere deals with things like insight, visual, spatial skills. How well can you visualize things in your mind? You know, 3D perception, intuition, instincts, artistic skills, creativity. You may have heard of that before, like people who are heavily right brain tend to be more creative. People who are left brain tend to be very analytical and logical, good with numbers. And you know, some people are extremely left brain, like they're super logical, super analytical. They may not be very creative at all. Other people, you're more free-spirited, creative types who may not be very good with math and don't like to logically analyze things in a step-by-step manner. They can be kind of extremely right brain. Most people fall somewhere in between. They do have tests that you can take online. You can Google around for personality tests to find out whether you're left-brained or right-brained. I usually fall somewhere right in the middle. Okay, and also as we've seen before, especially if you've already done the anatomy side, the left and the right hemispheres of the brain, you have fiber tracts, areas of white matter where switching takes place from one side to the other. So things that are happening over here on the left side of the brain, there are signals that are sent over to the right side of the brain and vice versa. Your two hemispheres do stay in communication with each other. All right, and so here is some of this, you know, highlighted in color here. In green, for example, these are, in here you have axons, nerve fibers within the corpus callosum that are extending from the left to the right and from the right to the left. And then in red here, notice you do have nerve fibers called association fibers. So those are where you have axons that are extending from one part of the cortex to another part of the cortex. And that's important for association, taking things like visual information, comparing it to past memory so that you can come up with what it is that you're seeing. So those are called association fibers. The fibers that actually cross from one side of the brain to the other can be called commissural fibers. And then projection fibers here in purple are extending, from the brain to other parts of the body. All right, that's kind of just an overview of the cerebral cortex. Your textbook has a whole lot more information if you're interested in reading in more depth about the cerebral cortex. It's generally pretty interesting info. The next video lecture, we're going to move down to the diencephalon, a deeper brain structure, and also some of the surrounding areas, and talk a little bit about what happens in that part of the brain. So your brain function is not only about what goes on in the cerebral cortex. So we'll pick up with that info on the next video lecture.